Thank you so much for everyone for staying late and joining us today. So, Freight Transport Association, we're a business group, we're a trade association. And our core reason that we exist is to shape, stand up, and support efficient logistics. We're experts in the field of policy advice, so our view of the future is around policies. So we think about safety and regulation, we think about business cases, we think about whole system efficiency, we think about evidence-based decision making, we think about the environment. And we think about it from 3 points of view. We think about it from our members' points of view to help them navigate a rapidly changing future. We think about it from a government's point of view. Our role there is to help them land their policies in the best possible way with the least negative impacts for UK PLC. And we're also multimodal, so our job is to help the multimodal supply chain work as seamlessly as possible. To help us think about these things, we've developed a Future Logistics FTA, which is a framework for thinking about the future. It sets out a destination and how to get there. It seems from our point of view, it may not from yours, that there's so many disparate projects looking at aspects of the future of logistics that actually the reason why we're wanting these projects sometimes gets lost in the excitement of the technical possibilities. So we think it's really important to maintain a focus on the priorities for logistics when there's so many options and possible directions. The aim of Future Logistics FTA is to define that ideal view of the future and then what policy interventions we need to get us there. So, what should we be aiming at? What are the priorities that logistics needs to deliver? What are the outcomes we want to see? What are the benefits? What are the ambitions for the industry? And then how do we get to there? What policy interventions are needed to give the right environment for businesses and innovators, technology people, all elements of the supply chain to flourish? And how can the current trials and possibilities form a coherent system? So what is our optimal system? How would it look like if we got it all right? The ideal may not be possible in all forms, but unless we define what we're wanting to achieve, an ideal outcome, we can't get as close to it as possible. A definition of ideal can be really useful for policymakers in their decision making, but it also should be a definition of our ambition as an industry, challenging others to come with us. So, what would our ambition be? Resilient and flexible. Satisfying customer demand is the lifeblood of the logistics industry. We flex our services and our delivery times to meet customer needs. We sometimes shape customer needs, and we're often constrained by planning and access regulations. But what is demanded of us will be changing in the future, and in ways we can only guess at the moment. We need to build a system which at every level can adapt to the changing nature of society, consumption, manufacturing, production and trading. Recognised value. Logistics should be and be seen as a high quality system, adding value to the British economy and industry. The logistics of the future will be increasingly technological, responsive and highly skilled, and only by increasing standards and delivering a great experience and by promoting a positive image of the industry will we be able to attract the right and sufficient people to join the industry to secure its future. Optimal efficiency. Today's industry strives for maximum efficiency. It's a perfectly competitive market. That's what keeps our businesses in business. But we'll need to use in the future to use all available tools to unlock even more efficiency, that last possible inch. There won't be a magic wand giving us more road space, port space, railway space. So whatever the technological improvements, we need to keep a focus on that. And the challenge here is as much for governments as it is for the industry and regulators changing their approach. Zero negativities. There's always going to be some externalities with logistics. We're still going to need some space, take up space on the roads. We're still going to need some power, still going to use energy in some way. But many of these negativities could perhaps disappear by 2050, and near zero deaths and injuries from freight movements, zero direct atmospheric emissions, all could be possible. But even if they're not possible, we want to put that out there as something that we should be aiming for, as a statement of intent, direction of travel, and our ambition. So now we know what future we're aiming for. How are we going to get there? How are we going to construct that future? We've got 4 building blocks to capture all the elements of a logistics supply chain, especially from a policy perspective. All these overlap and interact, but they need to be driven by separate policy agendas. Optimization of infrastructure. And here we consider the availability, capacity, interchanges between the different modes, ease of administration, data, information to plan journeys, and power for those zero emission journeys. And all of these contribute to this seamless vision that we have of journeys which are reliable and smooth, flowing, frictionless, affordable. Positive technology. A primary focus here is the transport units themselves, so bikes and vans and HGVs and even ships and planes. But it's also going to be about systems. We've heard a lot about systems today, delivering and receiving technology, smart infrastructure, back office, information sharing platforms, as well as more intelligent enforcement by our regulatory authorities. Talented people. Technology will not replace the need for people in logistics, but it will alter the type of people we need in logistics. More technology skills will be needed and high levels of systems management. And logistics has a big challenge here because we're not the natural home for these types of people to be attracted to today. And very importantly, whole systems policies. In the future, we're going to have to start looking at logistics as one system, not just modal or sectorial silos. And it's going to need to be an integral part of our towns and cities planning, as well as our national economy. We're often seen as the element that people want to get rid of when planning their urban environments. No, you enjoy having your coffee, you enjoy having things delivered. We need to exist and be planned for as well. We need to work with how we shop, how we manufacture, how we produce, how we consume. And this is going to require new business models and new and better forms of regulation and a real discussion of what a sustainable society looks like. So to complete our framework for each building block, we've looked at the international, national and local requirements and the vision for each if our ideal logistics system were true, if our ideal world existed, if it was resilient and flexible, if it gave recognized value, optimal efficiency, and zero negativities. And then we've looked at what would need to happen to achieve this. So what would the priorities be? This gives many pages of slides, but you'll be delighted to know that today we just have one to share with you. So we've taken the national requirements for the optimization of infrastructure. So our ambition, don't be overwhelmed. Very simple. Each mode is used to its optimal potential. High quality, lower cost. Reliable, practical journeys. How easy and basic they sound. Is that visionary? Well, delivering them today has been a challenge. If not, this would be our daily experience. And getting these basics right even in 50 years' time, will be the essence of what we do, of every business, day in, day out, every journey, every delivery, every product. These very same basics will be essential in the future, however whizzy the technology we use, as technology is surely just an enabler to fill our basic needs. So, what priorities do we need to to meet these challenges? Sufficient capability and capacity. How do we utilize technology to help us do this? How can we remove those bottlenecks to congestion? Power supplied for our new environmentally friendly modes. Now that sounds a massive challenge. Seamless payment systems for access to all infrastructure. We're going to need a new way of paying for infrastructure when fossil fuels are obsolete. And then how do we transition to that new payment system as well? Seamless transfer between modes, interchanges planned to allow that whole supply chain to be optimized using the best mode for each leg. And lower costs of creating and maintaining infrastructure and adapting our thinking to give sufficient focus on maintenance. Gavin, how are we doing against those challenges?
Thank you very much. Right, so I'll just begin. For those of you who don't know who TRL is and what we do, at the heart of what we do is future of transport. And we're looking to research and enable kind of future transport concepts and ideas and solutions and bring those forwards to real world ideas and options. We do that with around about 300 people, comprising of engineers, scientists, psychologists, looking into how we consider our transport options and with regards to freight, considering how we move goods and how we can change that so that we can actually help freight become the most optimal kind of system that we want it to be. So I'm just going to present to you now some of the findings from our research piece into the future of freight, and also some of the work that we're doing with real-world demonstrations and trials. Before I do, just starting with the current state of play for freight in the UK. So, as we all know, freight demand is increasing. Currently, we're looking at around about just over 200 ton kilometres of domestic freight shipped within the UK, over 90% of which is shipped by road. This is impacted by three critical factors: the socio-economic factors, such as a growth in LGV, so light goods vehicles, vans on our road network. This is largely attributed, despite a falling GDP, to an inefficiency in the transportation of goods using vans. We're seeing an increase in the desire to have one-hour deliveries and fast deliveries, individualistic freight services, which don't enable for more efficient transportation of goods. It requires a greater number of individual vehicles making dedicated trips for smaller numbers of customers. And we've got political factors such as the rising air quality agenda and policies coming into play, specifically the clean air zones which are coming into the cities, which are fundamentally changing the market landscape and impacting how operators actually undertake their logistics operations. In some cases, we're seeing this having a particularly negative impact on the industry, with smaller independent operators electing to go out of business in anticipation of these negative impacts of the clean air zones. Controversially, this may actually lead to a more efficient system as we have larger operators able to aggregate the parcel volumes coming through logistics. And then in terms of social factors, just on its own, we're seeing an increasing number of people migrating to urban centres, which is leading to what's termed an urban paradox, where you've got more people coming to the city, demanding more freight, leading to congestion, which means that the freight can't get there in a timely manner, which is affecting the performance of this industry. We're also seeing driver shortages in the industry. It's not a particularly attractive career to go into anymore, because it involves increasingly isolated driving hours, and is causing some quite a lot of concern in terms of driver mental health and well-being. So these three factors can be distilled into 5 key challenges for freight. The first is managing customer demand. This is trying to address how people order and their ordering habits, really trying to tackle this this growing trend of "I want it now" kind of mentality in freight. The second is the environmental performance, so trying to improve the environmental impact of the freight vehicles that are on the road and reduce the impact of our current freight patterns. As I said, we have increasing urban populations, which are leading to growing issues around congestion, which aren't really addressed with the environmental solutions which are put forwards. We've got the added complication of changing markets. This doesn't just include international matters. This also includes issues such as the clean air zones coming in, which are changing how operators behave. And then finally, we have kind of the driver shortages and restrictions, which are coming in, and they're quite an influential factor, and one which is critically addressed in some of the solutions which I'm going to go forward, specifically kind of autonomous vehicles. So just looking at some of the solutions, when we consider the solutions for freight, we want to look at them in terms of where they fit in the supply chain. So here we have platooning, which would typically be used or most useful in the interurban portion of journeys, where you can aggregate freight into larger volumes and you can achieve fuel efficiencies through improved aerodynamics of the vehicles. In addition to this, by integrating platooning into the logistics system, you're then creating a supporting infrastructure which is coordinating these vehicles along the same routes, so that you can increase the volumes of goods which are going along a given route at any given time and improve the utilization of these vehicles. And then looking at the urban scenario, really autonomous and automated vehicles are best suited to this. So we undertook some research under the Gateway trial, and we undertook a bit of research into AV freight in an urban context. And really we're seeing 2 kind of dominant solutions, so the drone ground-based deliveries and the larger freight vehicles, the LGVs. In these scenarios though, particularly in the LGV scenario, we're still seeing a desire from the freight industry to have a driver in the vehicle, so it doesn't necessarily solve driver shortages. There's this perception in the industry that if you've got a driver that is there to actually make the final delivery, then you're resolving what used to be the last mile issue, but you still have a last meters issue if you remove the driver, so you very much need it in that case. What do these technologies mean for infrastructure operators and highways authorities? In terms of platooning, a redesign of road construction may be required to strengthen roads to mitigate against rutting from the vehicles traveling on the same paths continually. May need improved junction designs to account for the people leaving the carriageway in the presence of a platoon moving alongside them. And you'll see this as a common theme throughout all of the technologies. Communications infrastructures will need to be upgraded and provided for all of these. In terms of the autonomous and automated freight vehicles, for drones, we're seeing that we'd need an improvement or enhancement of pedestrian infrastructure to account for the reduction in pedestrian capacity from the presence of these vehicles. In many cases, they are stumped by current crossings available for them. And for LGVs, we have a requirement for, in some cases, for automated technologies, improved maintenance of road markings, because in some cases they use these to guide themselves on the roadway. Again, new road design and layouts and communications infrastructures are needed. A large piece of research which we're undertaking at TRL is the independent monitoring and evaluation for low and zero emissions logistics vehicles. This includes 19 projects trialing different technologies in the real world, ranging from compressed natural gas and hydrogen diesel dual fuel vehicles to battery electric and aerodynamic lightweight trailers. In many cases, with all of these technologies, because they're trialing new fuel types, the supporting infrastructure and supply chains are relatively immature. So the cost to operate these technologies is comparatively higher compared to the conventional diesel fuels. So one of the key things which infrastructure operators will need to consider is the requirement for new refueling infrastructure and upgrades to supporting infrastructure such as grid connections, the electricity grid, and the connections on private land. Further to this is the consideration of how this might change driver behaviors and change how they schedule vehicles on the network. A key piece of research which we're currently undertaking is to investigate the feasibility for zero-emissions HGV technologies, specifically to address one of the key targets on the Road to Zero strategy, released earlier this year. The two primary candidates for this are battery electric vehicles and hydrogen fueled vehicles. In the context of the electric vehicles, we're really looking at potentially significant infrastructure impacts for operators requiring, in some cases, overhead cables or in-ground cabling, and then the necessary infrastructure upgrades required for the electricity grid. For hydrogen fuel cells, it's a little bit easier because the technology lends itself to the refueling infrastructure that we currently have. The issue with this particular technology is that the supply chain for hydrogen is relatively underdeveloped and the costs are prohibitively high as a result of it. This is something which we'd expect to improve with uptake as with any of these technologies. Just looking at future freight concepts, those which are slightly out there. So we've got ground-based drones, which we have seen in London, in the Starship Technologies demonstrations that are being undertaken around the world. Then you've got aerial-based drones, which whilst many people might liken that to clay pigeon shooting with prizes, we're seeing real-world applications of this, specifically in the transportation of blood samples to specialist test facilities. One concept which is of particular interest to us at the moment is Hyperloop for freight, and it's something which has very much come left field because everyone's focused on the personnel transport version of this, and freight's rarely considered to be a point of interest in this field. We're currently working with a company called Magway on an Innovate UK funded project, which is actually going to see a real-world trial of a freight Hyperloop system in the UK within the next 12 to 18 months. And as with all of these concepts, the value proposition here is to remove journeys from the roads to alleviate congestion, but also, most of these technologies are predicated on electric drivetrains, so you also achieve environmental efficiency and reduction of air quality impacts on the local populations. Just to finish, just to recap for requirements for infrastructure providers to kind of think about. In terms of alternative fuel scenarios, electric roads and electric vehicle supporting infrastructure needs to be considered. And in particular because of the significant infrastructure impacts and investment required from the operators and the providers. One of the biggest things that really needs to be considered is the potential change in role and responsibility that might come about for infrastructure providers in the event of an electric road scenario, because you may see a version of road user charging coming into effect in the actual charging for the use of the systems on their networks. The second key point for them to for infrastructure providers to consider is communications infrastructure. All of these ideas are predicated on new and more comprehensive communications infrastructures. In many cases, they can be facilitated by wireless infrastructures such as 3G, 4G, and the long-anticipated 5G. And they really need comprehensive ITS system, intelligent transport systems, implemented to manage these. And finally, the biggest thing which infrastructure providers can give to the industry and to the development of these technologies is the support for trials and developments of future concepts. And that can be through the endorsement of the ideas, the making available space for trialing these technologies, and freeing up, kind of removing the red tape that would otherwise be required to implement these ideas. That concludes my presentation, so I'll invite Elizabeth back onto the stage for Q&A. So I think just to get things started, I'm going to ask Elizabeth a question, then we'll go out to the floor. So Elizabeth, where would you say we are in terms of our road to the perfect logistics system?
Presentation before, so it's been very interesting listening it to for the first time and then piecing it together from that view of the future and also the building block. So for the building block for optimization of infrastructure, some of the words that I said really leap out, but we talked about smooth flowing, frictionless and affordable. And we have lots of trials of concepts at the moment. But for me, the future aspect which I'm most concerned about, and this is not a criticism, but it's just where we need to do more thinking, is about that optimized efficiency. It looks like we're going from a past, possibly, where you had one vehicle and one owner, and you took that vehicle from origin to destination. And now we're looking at chunking up that journey because the vehicle itself will not be suitable either for the electric road that you're going to be using for longer haulage. What happens when you finish your electric road? Where do you go then? Where do you get into your drone? Where do you get into your e-cargo bike? It's a very, very different system and a very, very different business model behind that. And we're quite used to logistics companies having as their unique selling proposition the fact that they can satisfy your demand more quickly than somebody else. But I think we're going to be looking at some form of sharing of vehicles and systems. And that's a very different way of where do you get competitive advantage as a business supplying and using these different systems at the moment. So that's my area of concern for the future, where we do need to do some more thinking as these develop, particularly on infrastructure and interchanges between these different modes. So I think rather than having 4 modes of transport, so rail, lorry, in different sizes, ship and air, it's almost as though we're going to have even more multimodal because our road journey will look very, very different in the future and be much more compartmentalized.
Yes. Brilliant. Is there, I'll put questions to the floor now.
Sorry. Big one.
Microphone, hurrah.
Yeah, hi, Nick Field from Mace. You talked about various options available. I mean, how would you future-proof the network? I mean, if you could have a conversation with Highways England right now and say you're building all these smart motorways, if you do one thing, think about this, you know, what would that be?
To future-proof the network. It's something which we are looking into as part of our zero emissions research. We're very much looking at the longevity of these solutions and the risks of, once implementing them, then becoming somewhat redundant because as we know, technology is moving very quickly within transport, and something can very quickly become out of date. I think probably almost the safest thing or solution for them to consider would be, solutions for them to consider would be addressing communications infrastructures and the electricity, the kind of requirements to upgrade the electricity grid, because I think addressing those 2 points it supports a number of solutions which almost, if you exclude hydrogen, it's almost a solution those are solutions which address so many potential options as to where the future could go. I think communications infrastructures, that would really help in terms of supporting concepts such as building information modeling and the growing desire to embed sensors in road surfaces now, or have sensors in cars. Yeah, so I think probably communications infrastructures and electricity grids.
I think we're also going to be needing to change some design standards in the shorter term to longer term. So there's been a recent longer semi-trailer trial, and the roads are not being built for that size of vehicles. And if we are particularly looking to chunking up our distribution network into real interregional, interurban types of transport, in order to optimise it, those are going to need to get bigger and bigger, and that is the direction we're seeing already. But we know that the planning regs for your roundabouts, your turning circles, your access onto motorways are already constrained in that area, and make it a less, well, more accidents because of that. So we may have to take some risks and plump for something in the future.
John Lamb, President of the Local Government Technical Advisors Group. Uncharacteristically for me, I don't really want to talk about the means of propulsion, electric, LGV, overhead pantographs on the motorway. Let's park that for a moment. I'm more interested, and you've touched on it in terms of the longer lorry, the longer semi-trailers. I guess Highways England account for 3% of the road network. And certainly from local authorities' perspective, and you hear it again and again, that we bemoan this great long investment and substantial investment in the motorway network. So if you look at the 3% of the motorway network, 3% of the network that's motorway, 3% of the network there or thereabouts, that again is the MRN that's in local authority control, you still got over 90% of roads that frankly will never be retrofitted. The sheer cost would be phenomenal. So the question that I'd like to try and unpack, and it may be that others around the the auditorium have got the answer. I'm not seeing a real debate or conversation about how the logistics sector can talk with local government about how we achieve that, the last mile, which I think is in some respects a reflection on my own sector as local authorities, not really getting that excited about freight. Here we are, last topic of the day. Is anyone else from local government? So therefore, I just question whether or not in 3-5 years' time we might have cracked the issue of propulsion, but we're still stuck with lorries that flow very, very effectively on a motorway network, albeit putting drivers under stress through having to drive at night, but then they're dumped into the mixer of a local authority road network that really doesn't get and never can really accommodate lorries, either current size or the future ones that you've been talking about.
Yeah, I think we've seen these gaps in a number of areas. As an organisation, as far as a trade association can be, so fortunate that I have regional policy managers who are able to work and advise and help with local government, but we're still not finding that it's enough. So we've had recent transport plans for one city in the UK that didn't even mention freight in it. So I do think we've got a large way to go on that final mile, and I think we've also the clean air zone discussions that we've been having and the interaction there have shown again the gap between. I spoke at the middle of the beginning of wanting to help governments, which include local authorities, land their policies with the least negative consequences and intended consequences. And the difference with ambition with a clean air zone of people delivering everything we've seen in some cities by bike in an area and needing, where's the freight going to park to get them into the bikes? How is this going to happen? That gap that you're talking about is certainly there, and we'd like to do our utmost to help close that gap, definitely. But you're right, it is there, and we need to do a lot more in that area.
I think just building on that, I completely agree. The urban kind of delivery scenario is very much neglected in the current research that's undertaken, and we are seeing with clean air zones, we're having discussions with local authorities who are implementing clean air zones, asking us to undertake impact mitigation work because they're so fearful that their freight economy might be critically damaged by these new policies coming in. And there are a number of measures. I've worked in the kind of sustainable urban and logistics field for a while now. There are a number of measures which have been around for a long time, which are quite simple, and they're soft engineering measures designed to change behaviors and change how we consider freight in the urban context. And they're very effective, but they require a lot of support. Once you've undertaken a sustainable urban logistics plan for a city, you then need driving force behind it to actually implement it. And I think in many cases we've not seen much movement in this area because there's not been central government funding to support the local authorities in this. And now we're seeing clean air zones coming in and the clean air zone funds coming in. We're seeing some attention being kind of focusing on this area, but it's certainly not enough. But it's something which we can't just look at a technological solution. We need to look at behavioral solutions as well.
Are other people finding the same and have the same thoughts in that area? Lots of catching up to do.
Squeeze a quick question in. Ian Oliver, Highways England. When autonomous trucks were first discussed a while ago, I think a lot of people assumed this was the death knell for the lorry driver. From what you're both saying, it sounds as if that may not quite be the case, but what will be required is lorry drivers or similar with a different skill set and a different working pattern. And in fact, the thought of maybe driver shortages, which I think most people hadn't thought of. So just like to have your thoughts on that, really.
I think there are some opportunities with platooning if we chunk this supply chain up and the platooning vehicles don't then go off the Highways England network where there aren't comms in place, where you would need a proper lorry driver. I think at the margins on some legs it may be possible to have a less qualified person who may be cheaper. But in order to deliver that high quality end product, we know, and we will probably always like this in the future, that customer service element of that final mile is important. So I think it's about changing roles, and there may be in some circumstances some opportunity to have a lesser qualified person. But I think some of the challenges to recruiting drivers are out with this, but also the very basic level, like those driver facilities at motorways, those driver facilities around other road areas, so that people aren't parking in residential areas and not being a nuisance or going to the loo in a bush or sleeping in a lay-by. So we've got those basic elements before we can get excited about the future as a country, I think.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think from a technological perspective, we're quite a long way off a driverless future for passenger cars in itself. So in terms of the application for freight, you're talking about much larger, much more dangerous vehicles. I think we're even further off for that. You certainly wouldn't see a heavy goods vehicle traveling in an urban environment, I think, under autonomous control. So it's, I think the driver issue isn't going to go away anytime soon. And I think just building on top of the the logistics sector's perception that the importance of the driver from a customer service perspective, they also see them as a important kind of intelligence gathering opportunity. That if they can see what other deliveries are being made into businesses, then they can feed that information back. And it's something which we're seeing, which we've seen when we propose solutions for simple solutions such as consolidation centres, which have the same effect. It removes the visibility of that supplier from the end customer, and it's something which they're still very much holding on to. I think in the trial we saw with under Gateway, where Ocado had deliveries made under autonomous driving, they had someone sitting in the cab, not just for safety from a safety perspective, but also from a customer service perspective, because one of Ocado's value propositions is that they can deliver the goods to your fridge. They don't really want to get rid of that anytime soon. So there's a cultural issue that's coming into play here, and technology certainly can't solve all these issues on its own.
Great. Well, if there are no more questions, thanks very much for one more question.
Good evening. My name's Graham Seaton from Highways England. You showed a slide of a electric road transport system with a truck with overhead power cabling and a pantograph. And the thought struck me that if you put two rails down the road, you've got a different kind of system.
It looks the same, doesn't it? It looks the same.
And given that Network Rail are spending a lot of money on electrification of the rail network, you also talked about whole systems policies. And I'm just posing the question that with more than 90% of freight traveling by road, are we in the right place with that? Or should we be thinking about moving freight from the road onto the rail network?
So I think there should be a long-term ambition to remove a large amount of freight from the roads, because we can only build so many roads, and it's one of the limiting factors. And you're right, there are other systems which we're not utilizing to their full potential. I think freight carries about 7% or less
7%.
of UK freight. And that's primarily because rail doesn't go where the freight needs to go. But also we've worked with Associated British Ports in Southampton, and they're finding that the rail network supplying their port is already at capacity from a freight perspective, because they've got to fit it in and around passenger transport, which the system is geared to. And it's not necessarily to say that the freight that's being moved on the rail is actually environmentally efficient. If you look at most freight trains, they're diesel, because of the kind of torque that you require to actually move these heavy trains, because you're talking about much larger, much longer, heavier trains being used. So I agree there is a certain element of utilizing existing capacity in other modes, but we are still very much limited with that in terms of how many trains can travel on the network and where they can travel to.
Although, funnily enough, if we're going to compartmentalize our modes with the urban and interurban and local, as we were talking about, the technologies seeming to inquire, it could help rail to in fact be more competitive, because more journeys are having to have these interchanges that we see between road and rail at the moment. Yes, I've actually got a question, an offer to you as well.
Sorry, that intermodal element, and going back to the days of sort of doing MSCs and it is that intermodal element and the cost, the delay of switching, and you look at stuff coming through, thank you, sir, from Haven Ports and then onto the F2N line and then up to Trafford Park and then so on. And you look at that, and conventionally, every time there's a need for a lift and a shift, you more or less sort of see, 80% of the opportunity to get it on rail just disappear each and every time. To what extent is there technology now available over the last decade or two, since I last really got involved with freight, that actually makes that simpler, cheaper, easier, that could help that shift to rail and other modes?
Yeah, so if I were to think about what's good about rail for the future, so there's two main technological changes that I would be talking about. One's about the digital railway, so that will be allowing, but again, this hasn't actually worked in all locations, but the theory behind it is it allows trains, because you've got a different type of signalling, which is not based on physical, but based on intervals between trains, that increases capacity. But in trials, that's not increased capacity everywhere. But in theory, that could lead to a greater increase in capacity on the rail network. The other element that I look to in railways is that there's been a large increase in money that's going to be spent on the system operator at Network Rail, and the timetabling systems have been very, very piecemeal, underinvested in, and again to increase the amount of paths available for freight is a great goal. And I think the investment in timetable technology and new systems does give us some hope that that might in fact be the case, so we can get quicker paths and more paths investing in timetabling improvements.
In terms of technologies, there are a couple of technologies to kind of smooth the transfer between modes. Probably the best one that kind of springs to mind is the switch. It's a switchback system, so you can have your containers on the train, and a lorry can park up alongside the train, and the container can swing out over the trailer, and then it can drop on. So you then eliminate the need for cranes. So your transfer can be a lot quicker. Not aware of any system in the UK like that being used on any big scale, but it is certainly used in other countries.
I was also, very recently, we've done teaching sessions for the National Infrastructure Commission on freight, and we're just arranging one now for the Treasury's freight team on freight. So it may be that our policy team could work with your guys in that way, and that's because we can't all know about freight, can we? And that might be a quite constructive way to start thinking about freight in these urban levels, and as you say, everything that isn't Highways England or the Major Road Network.
I've learned something that
The Treasury have got a freight team, and we've met them, and we're meeting them again in December, so they're really keen at the moment to learn about freight. Lots of people are beginning to realise that we've neglected it for a while.
That's great. Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating session. Only remains for me to thank you for coming along and for you to thank our speakers.
Yeah, thank you for staying so late as well. Loads of questions.
There is a drinks reception at TRL's stand if you want to go and grab yourself some drinks.
That's what they're all here for, just to tell you.